We're back on Inside Politics. Our guest today is House Democratic leader Craig Fitzhugh. Representative Fitzhugh, the governor did make his State of the State address to the body the other night. The big issue coming up might have been, what are we going to do with this huge surplus the state has had? On the one hand, that speaks to the good stewardship that he and the legislature have done, because a lot of states don't have it like that. On the other hand, you could have had a fight, or may still have a fight, on how to spend that. He seems to want to spend a lot of it on education. I think that's going to be hard for anybody up there to really be opposed to, right?
Oh, I agree, Pat. And he asked us where we thought the money ought to go, and that's what we said. And he said, well, that's where it's going. So that's a huge start. That's a huge start toward a budget now.
One issue he did not bring up in terms of money and education was vouchers. You and your caucus are quite concerned that if the voucher program, and it comes up for a final vote next Monday in the House, that if that's approved, it will kind of undercut all the extra money he wants to put in other parts of education.
Well, that's true. It's pretty clear that a good portion of up in the hundreds of millions of dollars could go for that program, and probably will if it passes. So that just takes away from that pot of money that we have for public education.
And the underfunding of public schools, not just based on your numbers, but on the comptroller's numbers, are pretty astounding in terms of how much underfunding the comptroller says we're doing for the state system, and that's the subject of lawsuits already in the courts.
Yes, sir. And this taking more money from that public pot to go toward vouchers, I think, is sort of another reason that we might see those lawsuits.
The governor also, for the second year in a row, is asking for pretty large pay increases for teachers and some for state employees. Now, under the state employee part, he wants to use a merit system of that. There's been some questions raised about that, about the comptroller too. Are you comfortable with that this is going to be worked out over time? The governor said give the merit system some time, it'll work out.
Well, I'm not comfortable. I hope so. I have a small business myself, and I know one of the hardest things that we do is rank or rate our employees for merit pay. So it's tough when you have a big system like that. But the other thing right now, it's sort of getting the state employees, because their raises won't start for another 6 months because they have to be measured and under their performance. So it sort of hurts them right off the bat.
Now, the governor did say during his speech he wants to give some special attention this year to some overlooked positions in state government. He specifically mentioned correctional officers. He mentioned DCS employees. Is that a movement in the right direction? Sometimes those folks don't get the raises that others have in the past, or have gotten overlooked.
And that's exactly right, and I applaud that. These, especially the DCS and Department of Correction employees, they take on added responsibility. They're almost law enforcement officers now, and we're not paying them like for the duties that they do.
Governor wants to spend some of the surplus on sprucing up state facilities like parks, like education. Those are some, particularly in the parks area, that the private sector looked at, because the governor's been thinking about privatizing their operations, and said no thank you, because the facilities are in such poor shape, they thought. So does the legislature give more money to that and then the governor turn around and privatize?
Well, I hope not. I hope that there are some things that just ought to be government functions, and I think parks are one of those. We certainly have to take care of them, but I wouldn't be for turning them over to a private entity. I'd be for fixing them up. But
now, the governor says he hasn't made his mind up about whether he wants to go through a privatization. He's also said he doesn't know whether he's required to send such a plan, if he does decide to privatize, to lawmakers. Would he be making a mistake if he doesn't send that to you?
I believe so. I believe that's a bipartisan issue that people want to hear about, and I think there's some things in the budget that show that he's moving in that direction. So yes, I think it's certainly something the legislature ought to weigh in on.
The governor also talked about the new governance plan he has for higher education that would basically set up for all the regent schools, the 6 colleges and universities in the state, set up separate boards for them. That's a lot of appointing power. Do you think that's a good idea? He wants to have the Board of Regents concentrate more on the communities and technical schools.
Well, I think the first question is, is this going to improve education? Remember, we looked at this back when the Complete College Act started, and we decided that, you know, maybe it's a little unwieldy, but it's as good as any system in the country. So the second thing, if you want to go through with it, once you determine that it's going to do some good, is who makes the appointments. I can see where the House and the Senate might be wanting to make some of these appointments as well.
Do you think that's something that might happen? I mean, in recent years, when the legislature has appointed or expanded boards, they've tended to want to be a part of that.
Correct.
But aren't you imposing on the governor's historic right to be able to make those? That's not been a legislative function, and now suddenly it's becoming more and more.
Well, I personally agree with that what you just said, but I think many of my colleagues, speakers included, want to have a part in that.
Now, One final question about the governor's state of the state. He spoke about the state needing to spend more money to help out our most vulnerable citizens. He specifically mentioned the developmentally disabled. Were you disappointed, though, that he didn't say anything about TennCare or about Insure Tennessee?
Well, absolutely. It's the biggest issue facing Tennesseans, and the true facts of the matter is we won't have to spend more money. We will just have to accept federal money, which much of it came from Tennessee in the first place. So it was a real disappointment that this is what could be his shining star, and he's sort of backed off of it.
But it's kind of hard for you to criticize the governor much. He's one of the few, if only Republicans, who say anything good about Obamacare. And if he turns against it completely, you've got no place to go.
That's true. He introduced it, and we're certainly for it. But we're hopeful that, well, actually, we have a bill to allow the public to vote on that in the November election, so that it's going to be not a vote that's mandatory, but it will give a preference. So if I'm hopeful that if some legislators that are on the fence, they see that their constituents want this to happen.
Referendums like that are constitutional in Tennessee.
Yes,
they are allowed.
We've checked that out, and it's not binding, but it's an advisory referendum. So
much like, if I'll point out, we did that twice to leave the Union back in the 1860s.
Oh, is that right?
Yes, there was a referendum vote on both of those.
But
But do you think that has any kind of chance at all? I mean, is there more chance that they'd pass Insure Tennessee than they'd have a referendum on the ballot when all the Republicans are running for re-election?
Well, you know, I think it might give some cover to some of my colleagues.
Let's take a break. We're talking to Craig Fitzhugh. He's the Democratic leader of the House in the Tennessee General Assembly. Back to continue our conversation with him after you watch these messages.